So we are delighted to have today with us in our Bar Ilan University Vision Science online seminar, Professor Liad Mudrik from the School of Psychological Science at Tel Aviv University. Professor Mudrik started her academic career as a student in the interdisciplinary program for outstanding students. She completed 2 PhD dissertations at Tel Aviv University. Her PhD in cognitive neuroscience in the psychology department focused on the role of consciousness and attention in processing contextual violations under the supervision of Professor Dominique Lamy and Professor Leon Duell from the Hebrew University. Her PhD in philosophy was a descriptive, constructive analysis of the mind-body problem in neuroscience under the supervision of Professor Marcelo Dascal, for which he was awarded the Robert J. Glushko Prize for Outstanding Dissertations in Cognitive Science. After her PhDs, she continued to a postdoctoral fellowship at Caltech, working together with Professor Christoph Koch and Professor Ralph Adolphs. After that, she joined as faculty the Tel Aviv University School of Psychological Science and the Sagol School for Neuroscience. She's a member of the Israel Young Academy of Sciences. She publishes in top leading journals as Science, Nature, Nature Human Behavior, Nature Communications, Trends in Cognitive Sciences, Psych Science, and many more. Her work is covered by the media, including in Science, Scientific American, Forbes, Quanta Magazine, and others. Her work is funded by many prestigious grants, including the ERC, NSF, BSF, ISF, GIF, Templeton Foundation, and other funding agencies. On top of her scientific career, she's also a national radio personality hosting radio programs for many years. Today, she heads the High-Level Cognition Lab, where she studies the neural and cognitive mechanisms of high-level cognition, focusing on conscious experience and its functions, using mostly electrophysiological and behavioral methods. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Liad, to our seminar to hear about your exciting research, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sharon, also for this lovely introduction. I wasn't expecting so many things to be said about me, and I should also say that I'm no longer a member of the Young Israeli Academy of Sciences because I'm not young anymore, unfortunately. So today I'm going to speak about our work on consciousness and the brain, specifically comparing and testing neuroscientific theories of consciousness. And I will first explain what I mean by theories of consciousness, and then ask how they are tested, if they can be arbitrated, and why this is important. So I'll start with theories of consciousness. And what happened in the field of consciousness is that in recent years, we see more and more studies and researchers who turn from the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, which was the main agenda of the field for many years, to try and suggest theories of consciousness and also arbitrate between them. We actually have so many theories these days. I think in a recent review by Anil Seth and Tim Bain, they counted 22 theories of consciousness, that it's becoming pretty hard to do this kind of assessment of all these theories. And one of the things that you also see when you read reviews from the different theories is that you get very different worldviews and very different answers about the question of what is consciousness and how it comes about in the brain. I should say that when I speak about consciousness, I'm talking about conscious perception. And when I speak about theories of consciousness, I refer to theories that try to explain the relations between neural activity and conscious experiences. Specifically, I'm going to focus in this talk on 4 theories. One is, here they are. One is the global neuronal workspace, suggested by Dehan and Nakash, and originally actually a psychological theory suggested by Bernard Bars. And the idea there, I'm going to present each one of them in a nutshell. It doesn't do justice to any of them, but I'm hoping that it will give you a gist of what these theories are. So according to the global neuronal workspace theory, unconscious processes are mediated by encapsulated modules that are already specialized to process specific kinds of information. But only when the information crosses the signal crosses a specific threshold, it enters to the global neuronal workspace. It's being amplified by attention, and that workspace broadcasts the information throughout the brain. When we have this kind of broadcast, then we are conscious of that information, and the global neuronal workspace is held to be primarily located in frontoparietal areas. Integrated information theory, suggested by Giulio Tononi, also Melanie Bolli and Christoph Koch have been working on it, is a theory that is quite different from all the others. It starts with phenomenology. So they define 5 axioms that are supposed to characterize every conscious experience. And from these axioms, they derive postulates that are held to specify how a system should be built in order to be able to uphold these axioms. And basically, it amounts to measuring the amount of integrated information the system has, famously known as the letter phi, or signified by the letter phi. And the theory has received a lot of attention, especially recently. You might have heard about it. It's the people who criticize it think very strongly that it doesn't even count as a scientific theory. It has been accused in being pseudoscience and so on. The proponents of the theory claim that all these criticisms are based on misunderstandings of the theory, and that it, in fact, is the only theory that gives you more than a description and also offers an explanation. I'm just presenting it. I'm not picking sides here. Higher order thought theories, interestingly, starting with a philosophical account by David Rosenthal and then being introduced into neuroscience in a way by Hak-Wan Lau, and then other scientists like Joseph Ledoux, Axel Clearmans, and others have developed their own versions of these theories. Basically, the idea there is that if you have a first order representation of the sensory information that you are about to experience, then you must have a higher order state, arguably in prefrontal cortex, that points at or re-represents that information, telling you this is what I am conscious of now. So it's not enough to have the first order representations. In order to be conscious of them, you also need this higher order meta representation that would index that this is the content of your conscious perception. And finally, recurrent processing and predictive processing in the review by Seth and Bain, they combined them together, but they are actually 2 different theories. I will focus on the predictive processing part, and the recurrent processing part. The idea there, and the main proponent is Victor Lame, is that it's enough, you don't need any higher order representation. It's enough to have the first order representation within sensory areas, as long as there is recurrent processing. So feed-forward processing is not enough. That would only give you unconscious processes. But when you have feedback, and in this case, within the sensory areas, not outside the sensory areas, then the information becomes conscious, and then you're also able to perform different functions like perceptual grouping and so on and so forth. So these are, you got a taste from the 4 different theories. As I said, there are 22. These are not necessarily the best ones or the most accurate ones, but these are the ones that have been mostly studied and discussed in the literature. So when you go over reviews, these are the 4 that are typically mentioned. And what we wanted to do is to ask how they have been tested empirically. So this is work led by Itai Yaron, a PhD student in my lab, and if I may say so, quite a genius one. Together with Lucia Meloni and Michael Pitts, we basically asked, how can it be that we have such different theories, each one of them supported by empirical data? So if you read the review, then you become very convinced that this is indeed the account of conscious processing in the brain, but the accounts are different. We find that the field is highly fractionated with many different, in a way, camps holding different opinions about consciousness and the brain. And we also observe that there is hardly any crosstalk between the theories. So you don't get, for example, someone from GNW testing IIT or vice versa. They are more into looking for evidence that would test their own predictions. And on the other hand, we also see that there is high heterogeneity of methods in the field. So Itai basically wanted to ask, could the last point be somewhat an explorator, could perhaps provide us with an explanation to the first 3. So what Itai did was to collect all papers, all neuroscientific papers, I should say, that referred to one of these 4 theories, either by quoting one of 3 key papers that we defined, or by referring to the theories in the abstract or title or keywords. And we started with about 7K papers. We ended up with 365, reporting the results of 412 experiments. The first question that we ask is, how do these experiments divide between theories? And as you can see, the theories have not been equally tested. So G&W has received way more empirical attention than other theories. And you can see that higher order thought, although widely discussed in philosophical papers, has not been tested to such a degree in the neuroscientific literature. Another interesting thing that you see here is that we get way more papers supporting a theory, here in blue, than papers challenging a theory. And this kind of confirmatory bias is, of course, not unique to our field. We know that generally speaking, people are, they tend to just, sometimes you just find the result and you say, this is in line with this theory or that theory. So then you become way more into confirming ideas than challenging them. Although if you go with the Popper, for example, in the philosophy of science, then you probably believe that science progresses through challenging ideas and not through confirming ideas. We also wanted to ask whether there is indeed no crosstalk, as we thought. And our way to define crosstalk between theories is if we now look at the amount of supporting papers over time. So this is just a toy model. So the x-axis would be years and the y-axis is the number of papers. If indeed there is crosstalk, then we would expect that the success of one theory here in blue would lead to the elimination, in a way, to the other theory, which will not gain more and more support. So we wanted to know, if we now look at these papers over time, will we find such a trend? And the answer is no. So when you look at papers mentioning the theories, supporting them or challenging them, you basically see that all the theories, again, besides higher order thought, that is kind of an outlier here, they just gain more and more support over time. So we think that this limited crosstalk is also somewhat concerning. Our next step was to ask, why is that happening? And Itai hypothesized that it could be related to the fact that we don't have many experiments that to begin with were devised in order to test predictions by one of the theories. So he classified the papers according to that, the experiments, and he saw that only a third were experiments where in the introduction of the paper, it was set up as if they are now trying to test the prediction of at least one theory. And we here take the author's word as is. So if they say that they tested a theory, we assume that they didn't write the introduction in retrospect, and that was how the experiment was indeed planned. You can see that 2/3 of the paper, either either just interpret their findings post hoc in light of one of the theories, or just mention the theories in passing. Very interestingly, when you look at papers or experiments that ended up challenging the theories, you see that many more of those were theory-driven. So were devised to begin with to test a prediction of one theory. So we think that, and this also doesn't change over time. So we think that we need more a priori tests where experimenters try to set up predictions and test them in advance. And I should say that there were only, if I remember correctly, only 7% of the papers of the experiments actually try to test the prediction of more than one theory in an experiment. This is extremely rare in the data set. The next thing we asked was, okay, we have all these papers now. What do they find? So let's say that we now collapse all the fMRI findings. What areas would be found as differentiating between conscious and unconscious processing? And I'll show you the results. Before I do, I just want to caution you and say that this is not a statistical meta-analysis. So we did not analyze the data ourselves. We basically vote counted. So how many times a specific area was found as an NCC, as a neural correlate of consciousness. And what you see when you collapse over the entire data set, what you see is that almost the entire brain lights up as the neural correlate of consciousness. The cerebellum is out, which is a good thing because no one expects the cerebellum to be the seat of consciousness, so to speak. But none of the theories predicts this heterogeneity in findings. So none of them say that in the entire brain should be lit in this kind of contrast. And even more troubling is the fact that when you divide the experiments based on the theory they ended up supporting, you get 4 very different patterns of results. So experiments that ended up supporting GNW find frontal activations in line with the theory's predictions. Papers that supported recurrent processing find visual activations in line with recurrent processing. So I think this is something that we should, to the very least, think about and ask ourselves, how can that happen? By the way, I should say that that also happens when we look at effects over time. So with EEG, MEG, IEEG, you get this blur of highly heterogeneous findings. And then when you divide them to GNW and RPT, you find later activations and earlier activations in line with the theory. So that raises the concern that there might be some theory bias here. What can this bias stem from? So what Itai did was to say, let's look at the point where we started from, which is the high heterogeneity of methods in the field. Could the methods explain the variability in results? So what he did was to train a random forest classifier, and he fed the classifier only with the methodological choices by the researchers. So, for example, the classifier knew whether the sample was healthy or healthy participants or patients. It knew whether the method was masking or CFS or stimulus degradation. It knew whether the researchers used fMRI or MEG and so on and so forth, whether the participants reported on the content of their perception or not. The important thing is that the classifier didn't get any information about the results of the experiment, about what was actually found. What Itai asked is, are the methodological choices by the researchers enough to predict which theory is about to be supported, even if you don't know anything about the results? And I should say that the baseline is already pretty high because of the unequal division to papers to the different theories. So, if the classifier would say GNW, it would be correct in most of the times anyway, just because we have more papers there. So our question was, can we predict which theory is about to be supported over and beyond this baseline? And the answer is that we can. And we can to a surprisingly high degree, so 80% accuracy, again, without knowing anything about the results. We also identified the important factors, which were using report or not, studying state consciousness versus content consciousness. So state consciousness is disorders of consciousness, sleep, things that happen that change the entire state of the system. While content consciousness is when you present a stimulus and you compare conscious and unconscious processing. Also, the measures of consciousness that were used and the connectivity measures. So I think that this should teach us some lessons, and these are lessons for the field of consciousness, but I think that they might go well beyond our field, because I would suspect that if you do the same kind of endeavor in other fields, you might find similar results. One thing that we took from this is that we need more collaboration between theories. So if theories work together, instead of staying in their silos, then maybe we could reduce or minimize to some extent the bias that we potentially see here. Another thing is that we think that we need more theory-driven work. So it's not enough to just find something when you compare conscious and unconscious processing and say, this aligns with this theory or with that theory. We need to come up with tests that would a priori examine the predictions of the theory. Another important question is, are the theories explaining the same thing? Could it be that we find these differential results because the way they define consciousness is actually different? And it's interesting because all theories say that they explain the same thing. So when you ask them, they would say, yes, our theory explains state consciousness and content consciousness. But when you look at the experiments that have been done that ended up supporting the theory, you see a very different division between the theories. And finally, there is no finally. Finally, I wanted to show you, I forgot to embed the link, but I will do it now very quickly. I hope you wouldn't mind. I wanted to show you that what Itai did was to also create a website where, let me share it with you, where it's called the Contrast Database. And I really urge and invite every one of you to go into it. where basically he uploaded all the experiments that he collected, and we since added 60 more. And you can conduct your own queries. So you can compare between the theories and say, how do the theories divide with respect to report versus no report, and go over the different theories. Or you can ask for a given, look at the global workspace and tell me which paradigms have been used to test it, how many of them were challenging and how many of them were supporting. You can even look at the map and see which countries support which theories to a greater extent. So we think that this is quite a nice resource. And importantly, you can also upload your own papers. So if you have a paper that supports or challenges each one of these 4 theories, then you can just start a new submission and start filling in the details, and it will be added to our website. So we really hope that this would become a resource that people would use in the community. So let me go back to the presentation now that I showed you the website. You saw the website, right? I was sharing the website. Yeah, okay, great.
Good.
Okay, wonderful. Now going back to this, any questions about that before I continue? Because the other part is going to move to a somewhat different topic. Or do you want to wait with the questions to the end? Whatever you prefer.
So you can continue and we will see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
So the next question is, what can we do then to arbitrate between theories? And I want to tell you about one such an attempt where we focused on the global neuronal workspace and integrated information theory. And this was done as part of the Cogitate Consortium, which I'll tell you all about it pretty soon, and inspired in many ways by the work of Daniel Kahneman, who championed that in psychology. And the idea there is that let's try to get proponents of different theories who, fundamentally disagree about some of the claims that are made, and let's try to see if together they can come up with ideas that would test their own theories. And this form of adversarial collaboration, supposedly, and I think that that's also what happened in our case, kind of pushes each theory to outside its comfort zone, asking it to provide sometimes novel predictions about things that it has been kind of overlooking. And if we go back to the biases that Itai unraveled in his work, that's an excellent way to overcome them, because now we kind of bring together 2 different traditions and ask them to work in collaboration. So for me, this started with an email I received at the time from David Podgeter, who told me that together with Christoph Koch, they're organizing this meeting, which took place at the Brain Institute, in the Allen Institute in Seattle, with the proponents of the global neuronal workspace. You can see Stanislas Dehaene here, IIT, Giulio Tononi. At the time, we also had higher order thought, Hakwan Lau, although Hakwan decided to withdraw from the process at some point because he didn't think that our experiments test his theory well enough, which is completely fine, of course. We also had some philosophers in the group, among which David Chalmers, for example, and researchers who came together to try and think about these theories and how to test them. And it was, for me, I was relatively, I was only 2 years or 3 years into opening my own lab. Everything was very new. I was sitting with these giants in the same room, which was extremely humbling and exciting experience. There were no presentations, only this whiteboard. And suddenly, like within 2 days, we started to come up with different predictions. So we tried to find the differences and the contrast between the theories and how they might diverge. And these initial ideas were then translated into 2 experiments. And at that point, we only had like these 2 very crude ideas for experiments that could test the theories. It took us 10 more months to develop that into a full-fledged pre-registration with predictions from the theories. The entire process has been interesting. I learned something about negotiation, going back and forth between the adversaries, trying to, convince them to add this test or that test. And at the end of the process, we had signed letters both from Dehaene and from Tononi, stating basically that the experimental design is suitable for testing the specific predictions of each theory, and that our predictions, the way we interpret the predictions, is accurate, which was important because we wanted to make the entire process transparent. So everyone knows what the theory leaders said before the results were known, and then they can compare it with what they said after the results were known. We also made sure that the pre-registration would be highly detailed, and we made it public. So people could already look at the predictions, criticize them, be inspired by them. And indeed, that already happened. So Leon Dowell and Rafi Malach, Leon, who was my supervisor, and Rafi, two of the scientists that I admire the most, they took some of these predictions, because the first experiment that we conducted was actually very similar to their own previous work, especially Leon's, and they reanalyzed their results, now testing the theory. So we already feel that even before the experiment was run, we managed to make some progress by forcing the theories to give us more precise and specific predictions, and some of them predictions that we didn't even have. Then we started with the data collection. It took us 3 years, basically, from...
Can you give examples, Liad, of the predictions?
I'll go. I'm going to get into them very soon. We started collecting data. We had fMRI, MEG, and ECOG data. Together, we have almost 250 data sets for experiment 1, and then an additional 200 for experiment 2. These are all different participants, but they perform the same task. So the database, which will be made completely public for people to explore, can also be used to ask other questions, for example, about compatibility between modalities and so on. The way we worked on it was that we took, for experiment 1/3 of the data, and we optimized our analysis. We basically wanted to make sure that if we find a null result, if we fail to confirm a prediction by the theory, it will be a meaningful null result. So that's why we had 3 different modalities or neuroscientific techniques. We had this optimization phase, where we told our teams and the adversaries, try every analysis protocol you have in mind in order to find evidence in the spirit of the theories. So then if we don't find the result, it wouldn't be because we didn't try. We tried really hard. And then we amended the pre-registration with the final details of all the analyses and tested if they replicate on the other 2/3 of the data, which was the second phase. And in June 2023, we made the results known. So we submitted it, uploaded the preprint, and presented it at the ASSC conference. I should say that for us, that's not the end, because we are now working on experiment 2. And after that, we will integrate across the 2 experiments. Before I continue, I just want to acknowledge the people who are behind this work. As you can see, it's a big group, and it hasn't been easy to also orchestrate the work behind it. And I want to specifically and especially acknowledge the students and the postdocs who have been doing the actual work on this project. Think about it. It's not easy to do your postdoc within such a collaborative big group. And I am extremely thankful to all of these people for the hard work that they have put and the excellent work that they have done. And also, of course, the PIs who have been supervising the students and postdocs. And I want to specifically acknowledge Lucia Meloni and Michael Pitts, my complicits in crime, as Lucia likes to put it. And both of them have been extraordinary. And I've just learned a lot from both of them. And of course, our project manager, Tanya Brown, without whom this just couldn't have happened. It's also a good opportunity to thank the foundation itself, the Templeton World Charity Foundation. I mentioned the Witt Potgieter at the beginning. This is a very interesting case where the idea for the grant and the idea for the project actually came from the foundation. So the entire idea of having an adversarial collaboration was their initiative, and based on this work, they actually followed up with several more adversarial collaborations. So there is a lot more that is still taking place. And of course, we should acknowledge the adversaries. So Tononi and Dehan for the courage to put their theories on the line and actually agree to this kind of public test. I'm sure it wasn't easy for them, and I admire them for doing so. So what do we have in the experiments? What are the predictions? The first experiment tries to track the mechanisms that underlie the multifaceted aspects of conscious perception, irrespective of the task, and also ask how a percept is maintained over time. The second experiment is a video game that we developed, where basically we compare between seen and unseen salient stimuli. Just to give you a flavor of this video game, it basically looks like that. So you have the player here, and very, very strong, and I always don't know how to make it quiet. So I'll just run it myself. So basically, it's moving and you're collecting these essences. And I don't know if you saw, but here on the right, there is a face. And the face appears for 500 milliseconds, but because you are so occupied by the game, sometimes you will miss it, sometimes you will see it. Every once in a while, we stop the game and we ask you basically, did you see something in that location? And then we get seen and unseen trials. But as opposed to most studies, the stimuli are very, very salient on the screen. Of course, the environment is very rich. We are now analyzing the data. We'll see what results we'll get from that comparison. But now let's go back to experiment 1, which is the one for which we already have the results. And let me explain the background. So thinking about the Mona Lisa, for example, when you look at it, our claim was, even without contrasting seen versus unseen, already when you see a full-fledged, clear image in front of you, there are many things that you are aware of. So you have the experience of, the beauty of it. You experience that the face is facing to a specific orientation. You see the colors. You see it for a specific amount of time. So we kind of wanted to create an experiment that would probe different aspects of your conscious experience. And as I said, our design was inspired not only by Leon's work, led by Eden Gerber, but also by work from Faruqi and Manli. So we manipulated the category. We had 4 different categories. As you can see, they are different. So we had kind of 2 clusters of categories. The first cluster is of faces and objects, and the second cluster is of letters and false fonts. And the reason we wanted to have these 2 clusters is that we wanted you to be we wanted participants to have a very easy task to differentiate between the clusters. So letters and false fonts are similar to one another, and objects and faces are also quite similar to one another and different from the letters and false fonts. We manipulated the orientation. So each stimulus was presented in one of 3 orientations. The identity, we had 10 different exemplars for each category. The duration, so each one of them was presented for half a second, or a second and a half. And importantly, the task relevance. How did we manipulate the task relevance? So at the beginning of each trial, we defined 2 targets from 2 categories. So you can see that the categories are always in the same cluster. Here, a letter and a false font. And then basically, we presented these stimuli in isolation. They are clearly visible. There is no doubt that you consciously experience them. But some of them are task relevant because here is the target. But we claim that also the other letters and false fonts are task relevant because they belong to the same categories as the target. And we also have task irrelevant stimuli, like the faces and the objects, where it's clear to you that this is not a part of your task. So now if we go back to the design, here we have trials where a specific face and a specific object were defined as the targets. We have task relevant stimuli that belong to the same 2 categories, but are not the targets. And we have task irrelevant stimuli that belong to different categories. And of course, in different trials, other stimuli were task relevant and task irrelevant interchangeably. So what are the predictions? You had 3 different predictions. One related to the content of consciousness and which areas in the brain should show representations of that content. The other pertain to the maintenance of a percept. So what is the mechanism that allows us to hold representations or conscious experiences over time? And the last one was about synchronization patterns, basically asking which areas should show synchronization with content-specific activity. We also had an additional analysis, which we call the putative MCC analysis, where we casted this very wide net to identify areas that could be the neural correlates of consciousness. But I won't get into that. It also wasn't a big, it wasn't critical for testing the theories. So let's start with the first prediction about the content of consciousness. So according to GNW, we should find information about the content of perception, both with respect to category and to orientation in prefrontal areas. Of course, it also predicts that we should find it in posterior areas, but the divergence from IIT pertains to prefrontal areas. For IIT, they predict maximal decodability of content in posterior areas. Now, because this is, it's not a unique prediction to IIT, then this was not a critical test for IIT. So in this prediction, this was a prediction that was more important for GNW than for IIT. For the maintenance of a percept over time, here we had very different patterns that were predicted by the two theories. So for GNW, you can see first on the left, the activation pattern that it predicted was to have like an onset that marks the ignition of the global workspace at the 300 milliseconds after the stimulus onset, and then another ignition at the end of the stimulus, marking that the content of perception has changed. So in between, there should be almost nothing in the global workspace, like this idea of silent working memory. But these updates at the beginning and at the end are supposed to index that the duration, to index that this conscious perception lasts for this amount of time. For IIT, you predict that after you have the onset response, there should be sustained activation prolonged throughout the presentation of the stimulus. So as long as you see a specific image, you're supposed to have sustained activity in posterior areas. When you look at RSA, representational similarity analysis, following these predictions, for GNW, there should be these 4 squares marking the ignition at the beginning and the ignition at the end. This is when you look at the testing time and the training time in these matrices. I don't have enough time to go into details, but if you want, I can explain later on. And for IIT, we should see this stable pattern of activation over time. Finally, for synchronization, we had this kind of triangle where we should find, according to GNW, synchronization. When you see a face, we should find synchronization in FFA with prefrontal areas, marking this broadcasting of information. While when we see an object, this synchronization should be found with the LOC. For IIT, we expect synchronization, but now with V1 and V2. Now this, I forgot to say that the RSA prediction was not critical for IITs, for GNW. So each theory had 3 critical predictions. This is a critical prediction for IIT, and it's also unique. So it's not shared by other theories. None of the theories that I'm aware of predicts that there should be sustained synchrony between V1 and, let's say, FFA or LOC, as long as you see the stimulus. So this was a strong prediction by IIT. We then kind of created this matrix that says which are the critical predictions and what they would mean for the theories. Now, what did we find? So let's start with the decoding prediction. So GNW said we should decode information in PFC. IIT, we should decode it in posterior areas. In fMRI, this is a work by Aya Khalaf. We find decoding of category, so faces versus objects, letters versus false fonts, both in posterior and in the front. So both theories' predictions are met by the data. We also see it with ECOG, so this, and with MEG. So this is Simon Henin and Ling Lu's work. So this result was confirmed for both theories. Interestingly, when you look at orientation, and I remind you that orientation was completely task irrelevant. So there has been nothing in the task that directed you to orientation. There we only find decoding in the back, and we don't find decoding in prefrontal areas. We did find, I should say, you can see here the MEG results. We did find a small blip you can see in the prefrontal areas occurring first early and then a bit later on. But the problem there was that we could not rule out leakage from posterior areas because the MEG data is limited in its anatomical resolution. we were unable to, we conducted two control analyses. One suggested that there is no leakage and the other suggested that there is leakage. So we couldn't, at the end of the day, rule out this option. So we had to conclude that for IIT, with respect to decodability, we find the expected patterns. But again, it's not that surprising because it's not a unique prediction by the theory. It's not a key prediction. For GNW, we confirm it for category. We don't find it for orientation. What about the dynamics over time? So this is now Oscar Ferrante and Alex Lupavo showing us data from MEG and from ECOG. This is ECOG or IEEG. And you can see first, when you look at posterior areas, you find this sustained pattern of activation. So you find electrodes that track the duration of perception of your percept, both in a content-specific manner, which is what you see in purple here on the right, and in a non-content specific manner. You see it also in MEG very nicely to the right. What about, sorry about that. What about GNW? So for GNW, we find a very clear onset response. So we find the predicted ignition at the beginning of the stimulus, but we don't find it at the end of the stimulus. So there is no offset response that is marking the offset of one's percept or the offset of the stimulus. We only found one electrode in IEEG. You can see it on the right. It shows a very nice offset response, but this response occurs too early. So it seems it's not in the predicted time window by the theory. It already starts 100 milliseconds after the stimulus onset, while the theory predicted it to happen 250 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. In MEG, we found this pattern, but in the mid-cingulate cortex, which is not part of the prefrontal cortex. So we couldn't find evidence to confirm this prediction by GNW. Again, we found the onset response, but we didn't find the offset. So we think that the theory now needs to explain how a percept is maintained over time. And I should say this was a novel prediction. GNW didn't say anything about this before. That was a result of this adversarial collaboration. Let's look at the RSA, reminding you the RSA was critical for IIT, not for GNW. We find the expected sustained RSA, this square that was predicted for IIT, but we don't find it for orientation. And the theory predicted that it should also be found for orientation. So this is yet another challenge for the integrated information theory. Sorry about this. I should have fixed the animation. I didn't realize that it's jumping all the time. I apologize. What about prefrontal areas? So in prefrontal areas, again, we find evidence for the ignition. We don't find it for the offset. So we find it only in the onset and not in the offset, and we find nothing for orientation. Also the task irrelevant condition, although we see something there, it wasn't significant. So for the second prediction about the maintenance of a percept, we basically find challenges for both theories. For GNW, it's a complete, the fact that we don't get the offset response, and that refers to a key prediction by the theory. For IIT, it passes the bar because we only demanded it to happen for at least one of the features, but the fact that we didn't find it for orientation is still a problem for the theory. Okay, next up, synchronization. Here, we actually, what happened to us is with the pre-registered analysis, we basically didn't find anything. We didn't confirm neither prediction by neither theory and any of the predictions by neither theories, but then we conducted a different type of analysis. It's important to say, not pre-registered. So already after we pre-registered it, because we didn't find anything, we consulted with other experts and we came up with this method. And here we do find evidence that align with GNW. We don't find the expected sustained pattern for IIT. So here we have a challenge for IIT, an important challenge, I would say, and GNW gets a pass, but I also want to emphasize that that's not the pre-registered analysis. So it's only something that happened post-hoc. In fMRI, by the way, we also find the expected pattern that was predicted by GNW. So to conclude, we are now at a stage where we made public the results of experiment 1. They are now under review, but I want to emphasize that it's only it's half the story. So you don't get the full story here, because experiment 2 is very important in order for us to complete the picture with the seen versus unseen contrast. Because, and this is something to say about the results of experiment 1, it's not a typical experiment in the field of consciousness research, in the sense that it doesn't have this contrast between seen and unseen. But we said we want to give the theories the best chance of their predictions being met, and that best chance actually happens when the stimuli are very clearly presented. And so we think that failures in this case are actually more interesting than successes. So to wrap up, I hope I showed you that this idea that we could arbitrate between theories, or at least make some improvement towards understanding the theories and revising the theories, we think that this idea of an adversarial collaboration might be a good way to move forward, and that we can learn a lot from this intellectual exercise. But I also want to say one word about why this is important, this entire endeavor. So I started when I was young and less modest, I guess, less modest. I took pride in the fact that my research is completely basic science, and there is nothing applicative in what I do. It's only for the sake of the puzzle. Now I realize that there is actually, I wish I had an idea that was smart enough to also be translated into an applicative result. And I think that what's happening in the field of consciousness in recent years, where we make more and more progress towards developing tests of consciousness, actually makes our work much more important. And I think that if we manage to translate the knowledge that has been acquired by the theories to tests that would allow us to arbitrate between conscious and unconscious systems and states, it could have an immense importance to society at large. So in this work, with the CFAR Brain, Mind, and Consciousness group, we try to discuss which tests, not only which tests exist, but also how we can verify and kind of test the ground truth when it comes to different tests of consciousness. How can we validate them? In another work, we try to ask how we can use existing theories of consciousness in order to develop new tests that would allow us to examine the existence of consciousness in different systems and organisms and non-biological organisms. And in a recent work that has been led by Patrick Batling and Robert Long, they brought together computer scientists and neuroscientists and philosophers working on consciousness. And we tried to come up, inspired by theories of consciousness, we tried to come up with clear markers that would allow us to test whether AI systems are conscious or not. And I want to kind of add a disclaimer here. This paper starts with computational functionalism, saying that according to this view, if a system is computationally equivalent in its functions to what we think are the functions and computations that are involved in consciousness, we would consider that conscious. Some people in the group think that that's the end of the story, in the sense that if the system has the right computations and the right functions, it is conscious. I belong to the more skeptic members in the group, but I still think that that's currently the only way we have to approach this problem. So I think that the problem of consciousness in AI is probably one of the most pressing problems that we have to deal with as a society. And I think that doing that, when we are armed with predictions and knowledge from existing theories of consciousness developed on humans, that would allow us to at least make more informed decisions or judgments about these systems. And I don't see any other way to go about it. So I don't think that a system that would have all these markers is necessarily conscious, but I would still hold that the chances of it being conscious are higher than a system that doesn't have all these markers. So before I take questions, I just wanted to thank, first and foremost, my wonderful lab, and also the Cogitate Consortium. So this is a picture from our kickoff meeting in 2019 in Chicago, and the CFAR Brain, Mind, and Consciousness group, where we started thinking about these tests of consciousness, and we are now working quite fiercely on it. And for me, it's a great experience. And of course, to thank you also for listening. So many thanks. And I'll be very glad to take questions.
So first I want to ask everybody to unmute yourself, and let's give Liad a big applause for it.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay.
And yeah, and Jeremy's gonna have a go, and if there's time, Liad is very short in time, so yeah, we're gonna make it.
I can be here until my class starts at 4, so I could be here until just before 4.
So Jeremy's gonna go.
So I'll ask a quick question. It's a very impressive body of work. I was wondering whether there's a hidden assumption in here in these sort of tasks, which is that I'm looking at your stimuli on the screen. Is there an assumption that you are conscious of nothing else? Not the pain in your lower back, not the sound of your breathing, etc.
I don't think so. So the assumption that we have is that you are conscious of the stimuli that we are presenting to you. And that actually was also questioned. So some people say, maybe you don't see these stimuli. So we conducted an experiment with a memory surprise test just to kind of verify that these stimuli are indeed conscious or consciously experienced. I completely agree with you that you could be conscious of many other things that are happening in parallel, but I would hold that as long as you are conscious of that specific stimulus, then we should still find information in the brain as predicted by the theories.
So you said that some of the predictions were critical.
Mm-hmm.
So as I read critical, it means that if the prediction is not fulfilled, then the theory falls, right?
Yeah, well, falls. I
Theories
think
never fall.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you start off with very idealistic and brave scientific movement that says, let's test them, and let's do the prescript. So then, if it doesn't fulfill, then the owners of the theory must come out with either adjustment or admit failure.
Exactly. So I think there are 3 ways they can respond. One is to say, I'm fully wrong and close the lab. I don't see that happening. I also don't expect that to happen. Especially if you only failed, let's say 1, or, maybe, I don't know, if you fail all 3, then maybe it's a very good reason to stop. Another option is to adjust, as you say, to say, okay, so for example, for G&W, it's the first time that they provided a prediction about the maintenance of a percept over time. They could say, we got this wrong. You still have the onset response, so we need to find another explanation. And I would really want to see that happening from that theory. Another option is to say the experiment was faulty. Something is wrong with the experiment. So here we had the huge advantage of having Daniel Kahneman actually consult us in this process. And he gave us a talk, and he said, he spoke about the 15 added IQ points that you get in retrospect. After you see the results, then you realize in retrospect that the experiment was indeed problematic and so on. And he claimed basically that no one changes their minds, so we have to be ready for that to happen. And I completely agree. There could be problems also with the experiments. That's why I also like it that we have the stages transparent, so we can also see when the experiment became problematic. And also, if the experiment is problematic, then I would encourage the theory leaders to come up with new experiments. Let's test it again now with a better paradigm. So I think that to the very least, these results should force the theory leaders to think and rethink about the theories and how they should be formulated and how they should be tested.
Liad, I have also a question. I mean, I think you may still have time. So
no worries.
The question is about neuropsychological cases. I mean, people with brain lesions and people, let's say the classical, DF or agnosia or alexia, people who have deficits in, let's say, perception, or you could also say awareness and consciousness. Do you take them, do you challenge the theories according to their, let's say, lesions and deficits in, awareness? Or you could think of or even left side neglect would be, you know, partial lack of consciousness.
So our project doesn't do that. Actually, that was one of the ideas that were discussed in that Seattle meeting in 2018, and we were thinking of creating this large database of patients. But at the end of the day, we decided not to go in that direction. There have been cases where lesion studies. So in our database, in the contrast database, we have cases with lesions, and I welcome you to go into it. I forgot to say that when you conduct a query, you can also download the list of all the relevant papers. So you could actually find all the relevant papers that used lesions in order to say something about these theories. And you will find some there as well.
And when you say we can add new papers, does it have to be our paper or a paper we
No.
think it
No, so the way it works, we have a scientific committee. So if you upload your own paper, then we just go over to see that it's complete. If you upload someone else's paper, then we send it to that author to verify that the classifications are good, and then it's added to the database.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. There's one hand raised, and I wonder, are you okay with your time?
Yeah, that will be the last question.
So last question, Kaula El-Khadi, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. It's really incredible. So I am a PhD student. I work about anxiety disorder and Parkinson's disease. So my question is about to impact or to benefit for some psychotherapy to development or to improve consciousness. For example, if you have some information about this, and I have a request for you if you don't have any problem.
So I want to make sure I understood your question. So you're asking basically if we can use psychotherapy in order to change the content of consciousness in clinical cases. Was that the question?
Yes, this is my question.
Okay, so unfortunately, as I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm not aware of such cases. There are many studies where they looked at changes in the content of consciousness in also, you know, in psychotic cases. There are many interesting studies about differences in perceptual thresholds in schizophrenia, for example. So there is some overlap between the clinical cases with respect to changes in the content of consciousness and testing theories of consciousness, but nothing that kind of immediately pops to mind that I can direct you to. But I agree with you that it's a very interesting venue to look into.
Thank you for your answer. It's really incredible. Thank you
so much. I do want to apologize for these animations. I should have.
It didn't bother our consciousness. So
okay.
So I want to thank Liad for a great talk, and really it was a pleasure having you, and I hope you're on time. I want to say next week we don't have a seminar. In 2 weeks we're going to have a Giacomo Rizzolatti here talking about the mirror neurons, the mirror neural system, so everybody is welcome. And thank you again, Liad, for a great talk.
It's also an opportunity to say that you have put together an amazing forum for this thing, and I'm super honored to be invited to take part in it. And
we're honored.
Well
yeah, fortunate to have so many great scientists join us. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.